Well, after months of considering its options, the government will tomorrow announce its response to the Gonski review of education funding. The review, headed by Sydney businessman David Gonski, was the most comprehensive study of school funding models in 4 decades. Now, it's recommended an extra $5 billion should be spent on education each year. The increased funding should go towards both public and non-government schools. A model where every student should receive a base funding amount with extra funding in disadvantaged areas. And it also says parents of students at non-government schools should have their wealth assessed to determine the level of need. Now, the government is expected to broadly endorse these recommendations, while the coalition has expressed opposition to the proposed changes. Well, for more on this, let's join our political correspondent, Lyndall Curtis. Lyndall, exactly why is the opposition opposed to these changes?
Well, the opposition, almost right from the start, from when the Gonski report was announced, said it would be opposing these changes. It has problems mainly with the question of how the funding will be indexed. It's committed to indexing education funding at 6% a year. The opposition says that will cost $4.2 billion over 4 years. There are other problems that the opposition has too, and one of those is the timeline for transition, likely to be announced by the Prime Minister tomorrow. This is what the Shadow Education spokesman Christopher Pyne said earlier today.
We're expected to believe that the government has the answers for school funding in 3 elections from now, in 2020. Mr Garrett has been out this morning completely incapable of answering any of the detail about how these promises are to be funded. Worse than that, the government has not been able to guarantee that no school will be worse off. We know from the Gonski review that the modelling shows 3,200 schools are worse off as a consequence of the Gonski modelling. They've been unable to answer questions about indexation and how much schools can look forward to in terms of indexation over the next 4 years. So this is a promise that this is a government that, of course, is again all promise and no delivery.
Christopher Pyne there on the attack, Lyndall. From what we know, the way that the school's funded could be changed as well over time.
Yes, what the government will announce tomorrow is effectively a 6-year program to implement the changes that David Gonski recommended, the changes to have a base level of funding for every student and then have loadings of that funding according to different sorts of disadvantage. And that change won't all come in at the start of 2014 when a new education agreement is due to come in. There will be some new funding starting from 2014. It won't be fully implemented until 2019, and that will be the implementing not only the funding change, but also roped into it will be some of the things the government's already doing to improve teacher quality, to improve school standards. There will be, although Christopher Pyne says there are questions about indexation, the Gonski report did recommend a new method of indexing funding, and it also did operate on the basis that no school will lose $1 as a result of the Gonski promise, but it won't all start from 2014. This is what the Schools Education Minister Peter Garrett had to say today.
The government is proposing that there would be transition arrangements which begin in 2014. So this is not a case of delaying any potential funding model. It's a case of recognising that current funding extends to the end of 2013. Transition arrangements from 2014 are what we are contemplating in this model. And remember, this is a big reform. Education is a very big system. It must be done properly. It must be done in a way that allows systems to adjust over time. And again, Mr Gonski's panel made it specifically clear that any future funding model ought to be transitioned in to enable systems to adjust and to make sure that the reforms that we want to see in place are given effect to.
Peter Garrett there, not giving too much away ahead of the government's official response to this review. That's happening tomorrow. But do we know how much money the government might potentially be prepared to put into these reforms?
Well, no, we don't, Simon, and that's one of the key considerations, because it's not just what you do with the money, but it's how much money you're willing to pay for it as well. David Gonski, as he said, suggested a figure of an increased funding of $5 billion, but in his report he said that was an estimate because the report's authors were working off 2009 figures. It's not just federal government money, it's state government money too, because the states have the primary responsibility for funding public education. Now, David Gonski recommended that the bulk of that $5 billion increase come from the states, but it may well be that the federal government does increase its own level of funding to pick up some of the slack from the states. We will see those details tomorrow.